The United States defense budget for 2024 came in at $886 billion. That number gets cited constantly as proof of dominance, as proof of waste, depending on who is citing it. Both uses miss the same thing. A budget tells you what a military costs. It does not tell you what a military is for. China's People's Liberation Army budget for the same year was approximately $225 billion by official figures. The RAND Corporation and several independent defense economists put the purchasing power adjusted number closer to $300 billion, still less than half. Still, by raw comparison, not competitive. Except the comparison assumes both militaries are preparing for the same fight. They are not. The US military was architected across decades of decisions that made sense in sequence. The Cold War demanded global force projection, the ability to place American power anywhere on Earth within days. The 1991 Gulf War validated the model. A technologically superior force built around air dominance and armoured manoeuvre destroyed a conventional army in weeks. The lesson that was absorbed from that war, and repeated as doctrine, was that American combined arms superiority was effectively unchallengeable. That lesson was correct for that war. The problem is that it calcified into institutional identity. The wars that followed, Afghanistan, Iraq, required different tools. Counterinsurgency is not the same problem as conventional force on force. The US military adapted, partially, reluctantly, and expensively. It learned how to operate in environments where the enemy did not wear a uniform and did not hold terrain. It got very good at that specific problem. And it kept the legacy architecture underneath: the carrier strike groups, the long-range bombers, the heavy armoured brigades. Because abandoning sunk costs is something institutions do not do well. By 2024, the US military was simultaneously optimised for global power projection, counterinsurgency residue, and the early stages of a pivot toward great power competition. 3 different strategic logics, housed in one budget, pulling procurement in 3 different directions. China watched all of this carefully. The PLA's modernisation program, which accelerated sharply after 2015 under the CMC reforms, the Central Military Commission restructuring that Xi Jinping drove personally, was not designed to build a military that could beat the US military everywhere. It was designed to build a military that could deny the United States the ability to operate in one specific geography, the Western Pacific, within roughly the first and second island chains. That geography contains Taiwan. It contains the South China Sea lanes, through which roughly 1/3 of global maritime trade transits annually. And it contains the operating range of every carrier strike group the US Navy would deploy in a Taiwan contingency. The doctrine has a name: Anti-Access Area Denial, A2AD. The logic is not complicated. You do not need to defeat a carrier strike group if you can hold it far enough away that it cannot affect the battle. You need missiles that can reach it. You need sensors that can track it. You need enough of both that the cost of penetrating the envelope becomes prohibitive. China has been building exactly that since the mid-1990s. The DF-21D, the so-called carrier killer ballistic missile, achieved operational capability around 2010. The DF-26, with a range of 4,000 kilometres, entered service in 2016. Both were designed for one purpose: to make the centrepiece of American naval power, the carrier strike group, a liability rather than an asset in the waters closest to China. The US Navy has 11 carrier strike groups. China has none capable of matching them on the open ocean. That is the comparison most coverage stops at. What coverage skips is that open ocean competition is not the scenario. The scenario is a narrow, heavily contested maritime corridor where range and missile volume matter more than carrier aviation. America built the world's most capable force for projecting power across oceans. China built a force for preventing that power from arriving. Those are not mirror images of the same competition. One is a sword built for one kind of fight. The other is a wall built specifically for that sword. The question of which investment is smarter has a clear answer, and it depends entirely on where you think the fight happens. The wall versus sword framing is not a metaphor. It has a specific institutional history, and that history explains why the US has been slow to respond to it. In 2010, Andrew Marshall, the director of the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment, a position he held for 40 years, formally identified what he called the anti-access problem. Marshall's office had been tracking Chinese missile development since the late 1990s. The internal assessment was unambiguous. American carrier-centric power projection was becoming progressively more vulnerable in the Western Pacific. Marshall recommended a strategic reorientation. The concept that emerged from his office was eventually published as Air-Sea Battle Doctrine in 2013. Air-Sea Battle proposed deep strikes on Chinese missile launch infrastructure, essentially hitting the wall before it could be raised. The concept was operationally coherent. It was also politically radioactive because deep strikes on mainland Chinese territory implies a level of escalation that most planners were not prepared to institutionalize as formal doctrine. Air-Sea Battle was quietly renamed Joint Concept for Access and Maneuver in the Global Commons in 2015, a title specifically designed to say nothing, and its most aggressive elements were softened. The Pentagon acknowledged the problem. Then it flinched from the solution. China had no equivalent institutional hesitation. The DF-21D and DF-26 programs ran on schedule. The PLA rocket force, elevated to full service branch status in 2015, equal to the Army, Navy and Air Force, received consistent budget priority through every subsequent 5-year plan. There was no debate about whether missile forces should be the central investment. The decision had been made and the bureaucracy executed it. That difference, institutional hesitation on one side, institutional clarity on the other, produced a decade of divergent investment. By 2023, the Center for Strategic and International Studies wargamed a Taiwan invasion scenario across 24 iterations. The US and its allies won most of them. They won at a cost that included, on average, 2 carriers, multiple destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. And those wargames modelled 2026 force levels. The trajectory since then has continued moving in one direction. What I keep coming back to is the procurement timeline, because it does not flatter the conventional reassurance. The US Navy's answer to the A2AD threat is the distributed maritime operations concept, dispersing the fleet, reducing dependence on carriers, fielding long-range anti-ship missiles in volume. The concept is sound. The implementation is running approximately 15 years behind the threat it is responding to. The SM-6 missile, which gives surface ships meaningful anti-ship range, achieved full operational capability in 2013. The Maritime Strike Tomahawk, which extends that range further, began deployment in 2021. The hypersonic weapons that would truly complicate Chinese targeting calculations remain in testing as of early 2025. China's equivalent hypersonic systems, the DF-17, carrying the DF-ZF glide vehicle, were demonstrated publicly in 2019 and entered service shortly after. This is not a story about American incompetence. The US defense industrial base, for all its procurement dysfunction, is still producing weapon systems of genuine sophistication. The F-35 program, whatever its cost overruns, delivers a 5th-generation aircraft that no Chinese equivalent has matched in operational deployment at scale. The Virginia-class submarine program produces the most capable attack submarines afloat. The problem is not capability in isolation. The problem is capability matched to scenario. Submarines matter enormously in a Taiwan contingency. They are probably the single platform the PLA fears most because they operate inside the A2AD envelope by design. The F-35's advantages are real, but partially offset in an environment saturated with surface-to-air missiles of the HQ-9 and S-400 class. And carriers, the centrepiece of American force structure, the symbol of American reach, become the most expensive liability in the specific geography that matters most. The historical reference that clarifies this is not a recent one. In 1941, the British Empire dispatched HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse to deter Japanese aggression in Malaya. Both were capital ships. Both were sunk within days by Japanese land-based aircraft, without fighter cover, without the tactical adjustments that the new environment demanded. The ships were not inferior. They were wrong for the fight. No one in the Admiralty had wanted to believe that either. The strongest counter-argument to everything laid out so far is also the most frequently made: alliances. The US does not fight alone. Japan's self-defense forces have been quietly reorienting since 2022, when Tokyo released its national security strategy, the most significant revision of Japanese defense posture since the post-war constitution was written. Japan committed to doubling its defense budget to 2% of GDP by 2027, acquiring Tomahawk cruise missiles for the first time, and developing counter-strike capability, the ability to hit enemy territory, which Japan had explicitly renounced for decades. Australia signed AUKUS in 2021, committing to nuclear-powered submarine acquisition. The Philippines, after years of strategic ambiguity, has been expanding basing access for US forces under the Enhanced Defence Cooperation Agreement, with 4 new sites announced in 2023. The alliance picture is genuinely stronger than it was 10 years ago. That concession is required by the evidence, but the concession has a limit. Alliance capability and alliance will are not the same variable. Japan's rearmament is real. Whether a Japanese government, in the specific moment of a Taiwan contingency, activates Article 96 of its own self-defense force law to authorize offensive operations in a conflict that is not formally an attack on Japanese territory, is a political question that no defense budget resolves in advance. The same applies to every partner in the coalition. Treaty obligations define the floor of commitment. They do not define the ceiling, and they do not define the timeline. China's strategic planners understand this. The A2AD architecture is not just designed to keep American platforms at range. It is designed to operate faster than alliance consultation can move. A Taiwan operation, in Chinese military doctrine as analysed by the Mitchell Institute and the Center for a New American Security in their respective 2023 assessments, is envisioned as a short-duration, high-intensity action, one designed to present the alliance with a fait accompli before the political machinery of coalition warfare can produce a coordinated response. Speed is the weapon. The missile salvos, the cyber operations against command infrastructure, the seizure of key terrain. These are not the opening moves of a long war. They are designed to be the whole war, compressed into days. Against that logic, the alliance's greatest vulnerability is not capability. It is decision latency, the time between an action and a coordinated response. The US military trains for this. It does not fully solve it. Now push the counter-argument further. China has its own structural problems that the wall versus sword framing can obscure. The PLA has not fought a war since 1979. The Sino-Vietnamese War lasted approximately 1 month, produced heavy casualties relative to objectives achieved, and exposed serious problems in combined arms coordination that the PLA has spent 4 decades attempting to correct through training and reorganisation. Whether those corrections have produced genuine operational competence, or competence on paper, is something no one outside the PLA's internal assessments actually knows. War games suggest capability. Combat is not a war game. The 2015 CMC reforms that restructured the PLA into theatre commands were administratively correct. They were also disruptive. Institutional reorganisations of that scale typically require years before units develop genuine operational coherence. The US experienced the same friction after Goldwater-Nichols in 1986, the legislation that mandated joint operations across services. It took nearly a decade before joint doctrine became genuinely internalised rather than formally observed. China's reorganisation happened in 2015. The operational maturation timeline from that kind of restructuring suggests the PLA reached genuine joint operations coherence sometime around the early 2020s at the earliest. The honest conclusion here is that both sides are operating with incomplete information about the other's actual combat effectiveness, and the side that has fought more recently is the United States. That experience matters. It does not, however, transfer automatically to the specific operational environment of the Western Pacific, an environment the US military has not fought in at scale since 1945. The data that concerns me most is not the missile counts or the platform comparisons. It is the CSIS wargame finding that even in victory scenarios, US losses are severe enough to degrade American military capacity across all other theatres for years afterward. A one war that hollows out the force is not simply a one war. That cost is baked into the current architecture. It is not an accident of the scenario. It is a structural consequence of building the wrong tool for the fight and then being too committed to that tool to fully replace it. The thread that has run through everything here is not about spending, it is about institutional imagination, the capacity of a military organisation to accurately picture the war it will actually fight, rather than the war its existing investments make legible. The US military has won that battle before. The interwar period between 1919 and 1939 produced some of the most consequential strategic thinking in American military history. Fleet Problem 9, conducted in 1929, was a Navy wargame that demonstrated carrier aviation could neutralise a defended harbour, Pearl Harbor specifically, years before Japan proved the same point with live ordnance. The officers who ran that exercise drew the right conclusions. The institutional response was slow, partial, and complicated by battleship admirals who had built careers around a different theory of naval power. Sound familiar? The carrier admirals of today are not villains. They are the product of a promotion system that rewards mastery of existing platforms, existing doctrine, existing operational concepts. The officers who rose through carrier aviation did so because carrier aviation was the centre of American naval identity for 80 years. Asking that institution to subordinate the carrier to a distributed, missile-centric, submarine-forward posture is not a procurement question. It is an identity question. And identity questions move slower than threat timelines. China does not have that problem, yet. The PLA's institutional identity was deliberately fractured by the 2015 reforms. Xi's consolidation of CMC authority was, among other things, an attempt to prevent any single service branch from accumulating the kind of bureaucratic inertia that calcifies doctrine. Whether that consolidation created a different problem, a military that reflects political priorities more than operational realities, is a question the PLA's first serious combat engagement will answer with finality. The Indo-Pacific is not static while this plays out. Taiwan has been accelerating its own asymmetric defence investments, drone swarms, mobile anti-ship missile batteries, coastal defence systems, following advice that traces directly to the lessons of Ukraine. The Ukrainian military's effectiveness against Russian armour and naval assets demonstrated that precision, mobility and volume can offset mass. Taiwan absorbed that lesson faster than most NATO members did. Japan's Tomahawk acquisition changes the calculus in ways that have not fully registered in public analysis. Tomahawks, based in southwestern Japan, in the Ryukyu island chain, which extends toward Taiwan, place Chinese naval and air assets at risk from a direction the A2AD architecture was not primarily designed to address. The wall was built facing east, toward American carrier groups approaching from the Pacific. Japanese land-based cruise missiles complicate that geometry from the north. None of this resolves the core structural problem. It complicates the Chinese operational picture. Complication is not the same as deterrence, and deterrence is not the same as defense. My read on this is that the United States is not losing a military competition. It is competing in the wrong category. The measures that dominate public discourse, total spending, carrier count, fighter generation, are measures of a military built for global dominance. China is not building a military for global dominance. It is building a military for regional denial. Those are different problems, and the solution to one is not the solution to the other. The reorientation is happening. The Replicator Initiative, launched by the Pentagon in 2023, targets thousands of autonomous systems: drones, unmanned surface vessels, autonomous underwater vehicles, fielded at scale within 18 to 24 months. The intent is to flood the A2AD environment with enough low-cost, attritable systems that Chinese targeting cannot keep pace. The concept is correct. The execution timeline, if it holds, produces meaningful capability around 2025 to 2026, which is precisely the window that multiple intelligence assessments have flagged as elevated risk for a Taiwan contingency. The margin is that thin. What does not get said plainly enough is this: the architecture problem is solvable. The United States has the industrial capacity, the technological depth, and the alliance relationships to build a force genuinely suited to the Western Pacific. The obstacle is not capability. It has never been capability. It is the decision, which has not yet been fully made, to retire the strategic identity of the last 80 years before circumstances make that decision for us. Institutions do not make that choice easily. They make it when the cost of not making it becomes undeniable. The question worth sitting with is not whether China can win. The question is whether the United States will have made the necessary decisions before the answer to that question gets tested in a place where testing it cannot be undone. If this kind of structural analysis is what you want more of, no noise, just the mechanics of how power actually moves, this channel is where that work gets done.